Morgan Freeman stepped out of the rental car, the gravel crunching under his polished shoes as he adjusted his jacket against the crisp autumn air of his hometown. The supermarket loomed ahead, a faded relic of his youth, its neon sign flickering like a dying star. He had not been back in decades, not since fame had swept him into a world of red carpets and rolling cameras. Why now, he wondered? Had he felt the pull to return? Was it nostalgia or something deeper, something he could not quite name? The town looked smaller than he remembered, the streets narrower, the faces harder. He had come to see his sister, to spend a quiet weekend away from the spotlight. But as he approached the store, a figure slumped against the wall caught his eye. The man was a shadow of a person, his clothes tattered and stained, his face obscured by a matted beard and a knit cap pulled low. A cardboard sign rested beside him, its edges curling, the words scrawled in uneven marker. "Anything helps." Morgan's gaze lingered. There was something familiar in the way the man sat, knees drawn up, hands clasped as if in silent prayer. Could it be? No, it could not. But as he drew closer, the man looked up, and their eyes locked. Recognition hit. Morgan like a freight train. Those eyes, sunken and weary, belonged to James Carter, his best friend from high school, the boy who had once shared dreams of escaping this town together. James blinked, disbelief washing over his weathered face. Morgan knelt beside him, the world around them fading to a dull hum. James spoke first, his voice rough as sandpaper, explaining how life had unraveled over the past 15 years. A chronic illness had stolen his strength, medical bills piling up like a cruel avalanche. Unable to work, he had lost everything. His job, his apartment, his dignity. The streets had become his home, the cold pavement his bed. Morgan listened, his heart sinking with each word, the weight of his friend's suffering pressing against his chest. How had he not known? Why had they lost touch after all those years? The conversation stretched into the evening. The supermarkets, lights casting long shadows across the parking lot. Morgan's mind raced with memories of their youth, the late-night talks, the promises they had made to always have each other's backs. Guilt gnawed at him. While he had been building a career, James had been fighting a losing battle against a system that chewed up the vulnerable and spat them out. Morgan offered to buy him dinner, a small gesture, but James hesitated, pride flickering in his tired eyes. Eventually he agreed, and they walked to a nearby diner, the kind with cracked vinyl seats and a jukebox that had not worked since the 90s. Inside, over plates of greasy burgers and lukewarm coffee, James opened up further. He spoke of nights spent shivering under bridges, of scavenging for scraps in alleyways, of the shame that clung to him like a second skin. Morgan watched him, the lines on his friend's face telling a story of resilience marred by despair. The diner buzzed with the chatter of locals, some casting curious glances their way, whispers trailing in their wake. Did they recognize Morgan? Did they see James as anything more than a ghost haunting the edges of their town? The weight of those questions pressed down on Morgan, stirring a resolve he had not felt in years. As they finished their meal, Morgan made a decision. He could not leave James here, not like this. He offered to pay for a motel room for the night, a warm bed, a hot shower, a sliver of comfort. James resisted at first, his voice cracking with emotion, but Morgan insisted, his tone firm yet gentle. They left the diner together, the night air biting at their skin, and drove to the nearest motel. Morgan paid for a week up front, slipping the clerk extra cash to ensure James would not be turned away. But as he handed James the key, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Would this be enough? Could a single night, or even a week, undo 15 years of hardship? The question lingered as he watched James shuffle toward the room, shoulders hunched against the cold. James stood in the motel room doorway, the key trembling in his hand as he turned to Morgan, with a look that held both gratitude and unease. The fluorescent light above buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the chipped paint and worn carpet. Morgan lingered in the parking lot, watching as his old friend stepped inside and closed the door, the click of the lock echoing in the stillness. The night stretched out before Morgan as he drove back to his sister's house, but sleep refused. To come. His mind churned with the image of James's hollowed cheeks, the rasp of his voice recounting years of struggle. A week in a motel was a bandage on a gaping wound, a fleeting reprieve from a relentless storm. By morning, Morgan's resolve had hardened into something fiercer. He returned to the motel, the early sun painting the sky in streaks of gold and grey. James was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the cracked television screen, as if it held answers he could not find. Morgan sat beside him, the mattress sagging under their weight, and broached the idea that had kept him up all night. He wanted to do more, to give James a real chance at rebuilding his life. A place to live, medical care, a job if he could manage. James listened, his jaw tightening, eyes fixed on the floor. The offer hung between them like a fragile thread, taut with unspoken tension. James finally spoke, his words slow and measured. He appreciated the gesture, more than Morgan could know, but he feared becoming a burden, a charity case propped up by someone else's success. Pride warred with desperation in his voice, a man torn between survival and self-respect. Morgan understood, but he pressed gently, arguing that friendship meant carrying each other through the dark times, not just the bright ones. The conversation grew heated, voices rising as years of distance and misunderstanding bubbled to the surface. James accused Morgan of pitying him, of swooping in like some savior after decades of silence. Morgan shot back, frustration cracking. His calm demeanor, insisting he had not known, had not forgotten, had not meant for their paths to diverge so cruelly. The argument reached a boiling point, James standing abruptly, his hands shaking as he gestured toward the door. For a moment, it seemed he might walk out, disappear back into the streets where he had survived for so long. Morgan stayed seated, his chest tight, searching for the right words to bridge the chasm between them. He spoke of their shared past, the dreams they had nurtured in high school, the belief that they could conquer the world together. Those dreams had not died, he said, not for him and not for James. The room fell silent, the air heavy with the weight of their history, and slowly James sank back onto the bed, his anger giving way to exhaustion. They sat in that silence for a long time, two men bound by a friendship that had weathered more than either had realized. Morgan proposed a compromise. He would help James get back on his feet, but on James's terms, with his input. Not as charity, but as a partnership. James nodded, a tentative agreement, though doubt still lingered in his eyes. Morgan left the motel with a plan forming, contacts he could call, resources he could tap into. He spent the day making phone calls, pulling strings, his determination fueled by the memory of James's trembling hands. By evening, he had secured an appointment with a doctor willing to see James for free, a small victory in a battle far from won. But as Morgan returned to the motel to share the news, he found James outside, pacing the parking lot, a cigarette, burning down to ash between his fingers. Something had shifted in his friend's demeanor, a restlessness that set Morgan on edge. James admitted he had been thinking all day, wrestling with the past, with the shame of his situation. He confessed he had not been entirely honest about everything, that there were parts of his story he had buried deep, things he feared might change how Morgan saw him. The admission hung between them like a storm cloud, dark and ominous, threatening to unravel the fragile trust they had begun to rebuild. Morgan stood in the motel parking lot, the flickering street lamp casting jagged shadows across his face as James's words sank in. The confession lingered like a bitter taste, and though James's eyes begged for understanding, there was a hardness. There, a wall built from years of survival. Morgan folded his arms, waiting, the chill of the evening seeping through his jacket. James stubbed out his cigarette on the asphalt, the ember dying with a faint hiss, and began to unravel the truth he had kept buried. His descent into homelessness had not been solely due to illness and debt. There had been addiction, a slow spiral into painkillers after a botched surgery left him in constant agony, a crutch that became a cage. He spoke of the shame that had driven him to isolate himself, cutting ties with everyone, including Morgan, because he could not bear to be seen at his lowest. The drugs had cost him his job, his savings, his relationships, long before the streets claimed him. He had been clean for years now, clawing his way out through sheer will. But the damage was done. James's voice trembled as he admitted he feared Morgan might judge him, might see him as a failure rather than a friend. The rawness of the confession cut through the night, leaving Morgan silent, processing the weight of it all. For a moment, anger flickered in Morgan's chest, not at James, but at the circumstances that had conspired to break him. He thought of the years they had lost, the pain James had endured alone, and the guilt that now gnawed at him for not reaching out sooner. But he pushed it down, stepping closer to his friend, his voice steady as he assured James that this changed nothing about his resolve to help. Addiction, illness, homelessness, none of it erased the bond they shared. If anything, it deepened Morgan's determination to see James through this, to help him reclaim the life that had been stolen from him. James looked away, his jaw tight. But the tension in his shoulders eased slightly, as if a small piece of the burden he carried had been lifted. Morgan suggested they head inside, away from the cold, to talk more about the doctor's appointment he had arranged. James nodded, and they sat in the cramped motel room, the hum of the heater filling the gaps in their conversation. Morgan outlined his plan. The doctor first, then a meeting with a social worker he knew through a charity he supported, someone who could help James navigate housing and job programs. James listened, his fingers drumming on his knee, still wary, but willing to try. The next day they drove to the clinic, a small brick building on the edge of town, its waiting room smelling of antiseptic and stale coffee. The doctor, a gruff but kind woman with graying hair, examined James thoroughly, her questions blunt but her hands gentle. She confirmed the chronic condition James had mentioned, prescribing medication and a treatment plan, but she also noted signs of malnutrition and untreated injuries from years on the street. Morgan sat in the corner watching the exchange, his mind racing with the logistics of what came next. The doctor's words were a stark reminder of how close James had come to slipping through the cracks entirely. As they left the clinic, prescriptions in hand, Morgan noticed a group of locals across the street, their eyes following him, whispers trailing in their wake. One of them, a man in a faded ball cap, called out, his tone sharp, accusing Morgan of playing the hero for publicity, of using James as a prop to polish his image. The words stung, catching Morgan off guard, and he felt James tense beside him. The confrontation drew a small crowd, phones raised, recording the moment as the man's voice grew louder, his accusations more pointed. Morgan's temper flared, his usual calm fracturing as he stepped forward, ready to defend himself and his friend, the situation spiraling into something neither of them had anticipated. Morgan's face hardened as he faced the man in the faded ball cap, the crowd's murmurs swelling like a restless tide around them. The accusation hung heavy in the air, a venomous claim that twisted Morgan's intentions into something cheap and performative. His instinct was to lash out, to set the record straight with the same commanding presence that had carried him through countless roles, but he felt James's hand on his arm, a silent plea to let it go. The weight of that touch grounded him, reminding him of the real stakes, the man beside him who had already endured enough scrutiny for a lifetime. Morgan's jaw clenched, but he stepped back. His gaze locked on the heckler, a silent warning etched into his expression. The man smirked, emboldened by the lack of a retort, and the crowd shifted uncomfortably, some slipping away, others lingering with their phones still raised, hungry for drama. James kept his head down, his cap pulled low as if trying to disappear into the pavement. Morgan steered him toward the car, the tension coiling tighter with every step, the weight of the confrontation lingering like a bruise. Inside the vehicle, the silence was thick, broken only by the hum of the engine as Morgan drove them back toward the motel. He glanced at James, whose hands were knotted in his lap, and saw the shame creeping back into his friend's posture, the brief flicker of hope from the doctor's visit, dimmed by public humiliation. Morgan broke the silence, his voice low but firm, assuring James that the man's words meant nothing, that this was not about optics or fame, it was about them, their history, their brotherhood. James nodded, but the doubt in his eyes remained, a shadow that refused to lift. Morgan's mind raced as he drove, the incident igniting a new urgency in him. He had the means to help James, privately, but the public's perception, the whispers and recordings, threatened to turn their reunion into a spectacle. He resolved to shield James from that, to handle this with the discretion his friend deserved. Back at the motel, Morgan pulled out his phone, contacting a trusted assistant to arrange a meeting with the social worker he had mentioned, expediting the process. He also reached out to a discreet real estate contact, someone who could secure a small apartment without drawing attention. James watched him work, his expression a mix of gratitude and unease, still grappling with the idea of accepting so much help. Over the next few hours, Morgan laid out a concrete plan: a modest place to live, ongoing medical care, and a connection to a local non-profit that helped people rebuild after homelessness. James listened, his resistance softening, though he insisted on contributing somehow, even if it was just small steps at first. The following day, they met the social worker, a no-nonsense woman named Clara, at a quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of town. She listened to James's story with a practiced empathy, her notebook filling with details as she outlined programs he qualified for, including job training and mental health support. Morgan sat back, letting Clara take the lead, his presence a quiet reassurance rather than a dominating force. James seemed to relax in her company, answering questions with a candor he had not shown before, as if speaking to someone who understood the system's maze gave him a sliver of control. But as they left the coffee shop, a new challenge emerged. A local journalist, tipped off by the confrontation outside the clinic, approached them in the parking lot, her recorder already in hand. She fired questions at Morgan, probing into his intentions, asking if he planned to make James's story a public redemption arc for his own benefit. The intrusion reignited the tension from the day before, and this time James spoke up, his voice raw and unsteady, telling the journalist to back off, that this was his life, not a headline. Morgan watched, a mix of pride and concern flickering across his face as James's outburst drew the attention of passers-by, setting the stage for another public reckoning. James's words echoed in the parking lot, sharp and jagged, cutting through the journalist's poised demeanor. The woman flinched, her recorder lowering slightly, but her eyes gleamed with the hunger of a story unfolding. Morgan stepped between them, his presence a shield as he guided James back to the car with a firm hand on his shoulder. The journalist called after them, her questions trailing like barbs, but Morgan ignored her, his focus on James, whose chest heaved with the aftermath of his outburst. The passers-by who had stopped to watch began to disperse, their curiosity sated, though a few lingered, whispering to each other as the car pulled away. Inside the vehicle, James stared out the window, his hands clenched into fists, the weight of his own defiance settling over him like a storm cloud. Morgan drove in silence, sensing the turmoil in his friend, knowing words alone could not ease the sting of being laid bare in public. The incident with the journalist had cracked something open in James, a raw nerve exposed after years of burying his pain. Morgan understood that this journey was not just about housing or health care. It was about restoring a man's sense of agency, his right to exist without judgment. They returned to the motel, the cramped room feeling smaller with the tension between them. Morgan sat on the edge of the bed, watching as James paced, his movements restless, like a caged animal testing the bars. Finally, James spoke, his voice low and strained, admitting that the journalist's intrusion had brought back memories of the worst days on the street, the stares, the assumptions, the way people reduced him to nothing more than a cautionary tale. Morgan listened, his heart heavy, and offered a quiet promise. He would ensure this stayed private, that James's recovery would not become fodder for tabloids or viral videos. Over the next few days, Morgan worked behind the scenes, leveraging his influence with a precision honed by years in the spotlight. He secured a small apartment for James through a discreet contact, a simple one-bedroom in a quiet part of town, far from prying eyes. He also arranged for a counselor to meet with James weekly, someone who specialized in trauma and addiction, a recovery, a step James had tentatively agreed to after their meeting with Clara. Morgan paid for everything up front, ensuring the funds were untraceable, his name buried beneath layers of paperwork to protect James's dignity. James began to settle into the new reality, his days taking on a fragile rhythm. He visited the doctor again, started his medication, and met with the counselor, each step a small rebellion against the despair that had once defined him. Morgan stayed in town longer than planned, checking in daily, sometimes bringing groceries, or sitting with James in the apartment's sparse living room, reminiscing about their high school days. The laughter they shared felt like a lifeline, a reminder of who they had been before life carved them into different shapes. But the shadow of the journalist lingered. One evening, as Morgan arrived at the apartment with takeout in hand, he found James hunched over a laptop Morgan had lent him, his face pale. A local news site had published a piece about their encounter outside the coffee shop, spinning a narrative of Morgan's charity project and James's fall from grace. The article included grainy photos, speculation about Morgan's motives, and a cruelly detailed account of James's past struggles. James looked up at Morgan, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and betrayal. Not at Morgan, but at the world, that refused to let him heal in peace. Morgan felt the same fury rising in himself, a protective instinct he could no longer suppress, knowing they had to confront this head-on, or risk it derailing everything they had built. Morgan set the takeout bags on the counter, the greasy aroma of fried chicken doing little to ease the storm brewing in the small apartment. James shoved the laptop away, the screen still glowing with the article's garish headline, and stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. His hands shook as he paced, anger radiating from him like heat off pavement. A man pushed past his breaking point by words that stripped him of his humanity. Morgan watched, his own fury simmering, but he kept his voice steady, suggesting they tackle this together, not as a spectacle but as a stand against the narrative trying to define them. James stopped pacing, his eyes meeting Morgan's, and for the first time since their reunion, there was a spark of defiance in his gaze, a resolve that mirrored Morgan's own. They spent the evening strategizing, not with publicists or lawyers, but as two friends unwilling to let lies fester. Morgan proposed a direct approach, a letter to the editor of the news site written by James, setting the record straight on his terms. James hesitated, his fingers drumming on the table, but the idea took root, a chance to reclaim his voice from those who had stolen it. The next morning, they sat together at the kitchen table, the laptop open between them, a blank document waiting. James wrote slowly, his words raw and unpolished, detailing his journey not as a sob story but as a testament to survival, a rebuke to the article's cheap sensationalism. Morgan offered suggestions, his presence a quiet anchor, but let James lead, knowing this needed to be his fight. When the letter was finished, it was a powerful piece, unapologetic and honest, demanding respect rather than pity. Morgan sent it to a contact at a larger publication, someone he trusted to amplify James's voice without twisting it, ensuring the original site felt the pressure to retract their story. Days passed, and the response was swift. The letter gained traction online, shared by readers who saw in James's words a reflection of struggles they recognized, a call for dignity that resonated far beyond their small town. The original news site issued a begrudging apology, the article buried under the weight of public backlash. James watched it unfold from the sidelines, his expression a mix of disbelief and quiet pride, the first real crack in the armor of shame he had worn for years. Morgan stayed close, fielding calls from his own team, deflecting offers for interviews or documentaries, ensuring the focus remained on James's healing, not his celebrity. With the media storm quieted, James began to take more active steps in his recovery. He enrolled in a job training program Clara had recommended, starting with basic computer skills, his fingers clumsy but determined on the keyboard. Morgan helped where he could, buying him a second-hand laptop, arranging for a mentor from the program to check in weekly. The apartment, once bare, started to feel lived in, with a few thrift store finds scattered about, a cheap coffee maker. On the counter, signs of a life being rebuilt piece by piece. One evening, as they shared a quiet dinner, James looked across the table at Morgan, his eyes clear in a way they had not been before. He spoke of feeling hope, real hope, for the first time in years, not just for survival but for a future he could shape. Morgan listened, a warmth spreading in his chest, the weight of their shared journey settling into something solid, unbreakable. They had faced the worst together. The judgment, the setbacks, the ghosts of the past, and come out stronger for it. Their bond reforged in the fire of adversity. The kitchen table between Morgan and James held the remnants of their meal, paper plates and crumpled napkins scattered like evidence of a hard-won peace. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed softly, casting a warm glow over the room, a stark contrast to the cold nights James had once endured. Outside, the town carried on, its rhythm unchanged, but within these walls a transformation had taken root. James's words about hope lingered in the air, a quiet declaration that carried more weight than any speech Morgan had ever delivered on screen. Morgan leaned back in his chair, watching his friend, seeing not the broken man he had found outside, the supermarket, but the resilient soul who had fought his way back from the abyss. Over the next weeks, James's progress gained momentum. The job training program bore fruit, his determination catching the eye of a local non-profit manager who offered him a part-time role organizing community outreach. It was simple work, sorting donations and scheduling volunteers, but it gave James purpose, a reason to rise each morning beyond mere survival. His hands, once unsteady from years of hardship, grew confident on the keyboard, his voice steadier when he spoke to colleagues. Morgan watched from a distance now, his visits less frequent as he prepared to return to his own life, trusting that James had found his footing. Morgan's final day in town arrived, a crisp morning with the scent of frost in the air. He drove to James's apartment, the rental car packed for the airport, his sister's goodbye still warm in his memory. James waited outside, leaning against the building, a new coat draped over his shoulders, one Morgan had slipped into his closet weeks earlier. They walked together to a nearby park, the same one where they had spent countless afternoons as teenagers, dreaming of futures neither could predict. The benches were weathered now, the trees taller, but the feeling of possibility remained, a quiet echo of their youth. They sat, the silence between them comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding of all they had overcome. James spoke first, his voice steady, thanking Morgan not just for the money or the resources, but for seeing him, truly seeing him, when he had felt invisible to the world. Morgan nodded, his throat tight, and admitted he had learned something, too, about the fragility of life, the importance of holding on to those who matter most. They laughed then, the sound carrying across the empty park, a release of tension that had built over months of struggle. As they stood to leave, James handed Morgan a small folded piece of paper, a note he had written the night before. It was a promise, he said, to keep going, to honor the second chance Morgan had helped him seize. Morgan tucked it into his pocket, unread, knowing he would carry it as a reminder of this chapter, of the man who had taught him more about resilience than any script ever could. They parted with a firm handshake, their eyes locking in a moment of mutual respect, the past and present reconciled in that single gesture. Morgan drove to the airport, the town fading in his rearview mirror, but the weight of James's recovery stayed with him, a triumph he would hold close long after the headlines faded. James returned to his apartment, the key turning smoothly in the lock, and stepped into a space that was truly his own, a foundation from which to build a life he had once thought lost. The road ahead would not be easy, but it was his to walk with the strength of friendship lighting the way,